next speaker is Dr. Don Spohn. Don has been studying copper for longer than most of us have been alive. He tells the story when he was in first grade, living downstate where he does near Grand Rapids. A young boy moved from the copper country down there and brought with him a copper arrowhead. Don had seen and probably had rock arrowheads and was fascinated with them, but when he saw the copper arrowhead, he was just fascinated. And he recalls trading a padlock for the copper arrowhead back a long time ago now, in first grade, and he still has the copper arrowhead, and he still has a passion for copper, and he's been studying it ever since. He puts out a journal, which is amazing. He categorizes all the different tool types and the specific types of tool types, and it's very impressive. He's had a long and storied career in studying copper, and he's the expert as far as I know. Let's get your thing up here, though.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. And I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking Bob and Robin and Larry and Buck in organizing this conference and for all of the very good material that's being presented. I know I'm learning a lot. I hope you'll bear with me. I have bronchitis that's doing its very best to turn into pneumonia. So my voice isn't as strong as it usually is. So that you will know something about me, I believe in science, and this conference has been aimed at looking at things in a scientific way. The worst thing that can happen to science is bias, because that'll throw off the end results every time. Yet we all have our biases. It's important that I tell you what mine is right from the beginning, and that is I am a practicing Christian. Now, I think that doesn't affect me, it doesn't make my bias too deep, and to prove to that, I'm going to tell you a Christian joke. And if you've ever heard it before, I'll make a deal with you. When we get to the end, you don't have to laugh. Now, there was a man who retired, and he didn't plan his retirement very well, and he ended up with a tiny, teeny Social Security and a very small bank account. And after a few years, he saw that he was really getting low. And yet he'd always desired 2 states away or 3 to visit his sister. And so that was the only thing he had on his bucket list. And when he saw things were getting low, he thought, I'll put everything together and I'm going to drive over and see my sister, who is a Catholic nun. So he did so. And he got there safely. And he had a week or so of enjoyment with his sister. It was like being in a family again. And she made him some sandwiches, and he began his trip back. Before he got back to his home state, somebody T-boned him. And he woke up in a Catholic hospital. And there was a nun sitting in a chair beside of his bed. And she smiled at him very kindly and said, "Oh, I'm glad you're awake. I have a question for you. What is your insurance? We want to contact them and get some kind of payment." He said, "I'm sorry, but I don't have an insurance." "Oh, can you write us a check?" He said, I wrote my last check more than 3 months ago." "Well, you have a bank account?" "No, I drained that to go and see my sister, who, like you, is an old maid, a nun." And her face became stern. She stood up. She looked at him and she pointed his finger at him and she said, "I'll have you know, we nuns are not old maids. We're married to Christ." And he said, "Oh, I get it now. Send the bill to my brother-in-law." Now, I don't want you to think that I am uneven. I like to present things in a well-balanced way. So there was this, I call this my son of a bitch joke. There was this Protestant minister in West Virginia driving down the road, and he accidentally cut off a guy driving a pickup truck. And the pickup truck whizzed around and drove him off the road, and he came over and he cursed that minister up one side and down the other side. And then he headed back to get in his pickup truck. As he did, the minister lowered the window, rolled it down, stuck his head out, and said, "I hope when you get home, your mother will crawl out from under the porch and bite you." Remember, it's my son of a bitch joke. We're going to talk about ancient copper mining. Well, first, this is Great Lakes Copper Research, and these are the things why we were formed and what we do. And I've spent quite a bit of time over many years putting together ways of gaining information. As you know, the best way to gain information is to get it through professional archaeological digs, where you have an archaeological history on every artifact. And then you can be relatively certain or sure of the information you gather. The problem is that with copper artifacts, less than 1% of all of those that have been collected to date have archaeological histories. And so I don't think I own an artifact with an archaeological history. I can't remember right now. If I do, I don't remember it. They're very hard to come by. Therefore, I have to develop means of reading artifacts so that I can get something from each artifact and then know something about it. Go ahead, next one. Okay, next one. This is, of course, you've seen this map before or something like it. I can't get that to work. Is that?
The wee red button in the center.
What's that?
Right in the center of the front face.
Yeah.
See a little round button.
Yeah. Okay.
Got it?
No, it's not working. So you can see the red line around will show you where most of the copper was at. Okay, thank you. Good. All right, you can see that most of the copper is in this area. Next slide. And when we get to the Upper Peninsula, not all of it, but most of it is found in this area. Next slide. And here is Isle Royal. And you know there's a lot of copper there. Next slide. And some of these pictures you've already seen today, but what I want you to note, and maybe you already have in a previous lecture, the similarities here and here. And they both have copper. And this is pretty much all the same here. So one might expect that at a depth of 1,332 feet, there might be a lot of copper still in there that nobody has recovered yet. Next picture. Copper appears in two primary ways, or the Indians would have found copper in two primary ways. Float copper, which was pushed all the way from here, where I'm standing today, to central and southern Ohio and similar places in Indiana and Illinois. So we have it in that way. Then it's where it was originally in outcroppings like this, and so probably the Indians saw a lot of this type of outcropping and worked it. And as you've been told before, many, or perhaps most prehistoric copper mines worked around outcroppings. And all successful copper mines in the Lake Superior area were built over prehistoric copper mines. Next one. Here are dates, and I think you saw these dates. They've been presented before, but you notice here it says direct carbon and indirect carbon. Here again, direct carbon. The difference is this. If you have a direct carbon date, that means that the artifact itself has some leather or fibers or something preserved, perhaps a piece of wood in a conical point, and it preserved by the copper salts. Now you know that that artifact has to be roughly the same age as the organic material. And indirect carbon here, like Susan Martin's 20 EK20, is indirect. Now I don't remember exactly, but it would be something like this, that no artifact was found with carbon material on it that could be dated. However, at the same depth, a few feet away, carbon was found that could be tested. And it was assumed that since they were at the same depth in the same dig, a few feet apart, that they probably are the same date. So they date the carbon and assume that the copper is that age. And of course, sometimes it doesn't work out. I mean, the carbon could be much older or much younger. Could be an inclusion or something. Okay, go ahead. Now, this, according to David Pompani and his co-writers, is the primary time that copper was mined in the Michigan Upper Peninsula on Isle Royal. This is the old world Bronze Age. Here, last year, these points were with us, and they date actually quite a bit before this 65 to 54 BP. And this is the New World, and this is the first record of the first, they call mineral artifact. And they call it a mineral artifact because it was malachite, not pure copper. And so it was more or less a stone. So it wasn't pounding or copper or anything like that. So really we have the oldest date probably here. A thing to remember is that by 1400, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and parts of other states were free of the glacier. Therefore, if the Indians were, as we think they were, very clever and inquisitive and experimental, they always saw and noticed the things in their environment and figured out if they could use them and how best to use them. So the question might be, if they moved in sometime here, then how long did it take them to find copper? It was a whole lot more abundant then than it is today, and people are still finding it in big chunks today and little chunks. So how long did it take? And did it take them 1, 2, 3 to 4,000 years to figure that out? Or did it happen much quicker than that? We don't know yet, but maybe when we get more carbon dates, they'll fall in this area. Now, by the way, there's an earlier spike of 9,600 BC here, mining in Michigan. Okay, next slide. If you want to look this up on the internet, here is David's name, and here's the title of his research. And so if you type those in, you will get the research, and this happens to be the abstract of the research. Go ahead. So how did the miners do it? What tools did prehistoric miners use? Well, we can guess to some extent, but we don't have to guess in many cases. Next time. Everyone agrees about one tool, the hammerstone. Let's take a quick look at it. Next. Here are two types, ungrooved in the central mine area and a grooved hammerstone. Primarily they are of this type, but some of them were only partially grooved. Some of the grooved ones were only partially grooved. Some of them didn't have grooves, they had nicks, and so they used the nicks as hafting anchors instead of a groove. Next. Here are various hammerstones weighing less than a pound to 37 pounds. And that's this one with a full groove. Next. Here are some unusual ones. This is the 37 pounder. And this has 3 grooves, 1, 2, 3. And it looks like it has copper impregnations before they actually made the grooves. Next. Prehistorically modified copper masses were recovered by the Indians. And this is the one you learned about a little earlier that was pried up and put on logs, and then cross logs, and then higher until it got up to 4 or 5 feet. And you can see that every square inch of the surface that has been gouged out, and so we don't know how much more it may have weighed in the beginning. And we can ask, what tools were used, do you think, to remove that copper from the mass? Next. Here's a picture of the log work that this was found on. Now, this crib work is one of the tools. It's a bunch of logs, and you know how it works, so that they could elevate it. In order to do that, they surely had to use a pry bar, or a lever, and a fulcrum. It was Archimedes who first wrote about the lever, and he said, give me a large enough lever and a place to stand, and I'll move the world. These are gads. This is a gad found, a copper gad found in the Minnesota mine, which was built over prehistoric mines. This is a Roman iron gad. Now, the purpose of a gad, the work tasks of the gad were primarily 2. One, you can put the point down, then you hit it on top there, and you hold it in your hand here, and you strike and you twist. You strike and you twist. You strike and you twist. And you're creating a hole. As you continue deeper, the hole becomes a little larger. So gads were used for drilling, and as far as I know, they were still used for the same purpose 100 years ago in the mines around here. The second purpose of a gad is, once you have the hole made, and you might make a row of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, then you can put gads in them, pound them, and the rock cracks and breaks away. Now you have access to the pure copper that you're after. And when I said pure copper, that reminds me of something. Remember, the only kind of copper that the American Indians used is what's called native copper. That is all vein copper, or copper that's been ripped out of the veins and floated, and it's called float copper. That's the only kind of copper they used. In the old world, they had some native copper too, but it wasn't in abundance like it is here. A little bit here, a little bit there, like we may have scattered around the United States in addition to here in the Upper Peninsula. When in the old world they ran out of native copper, then they had to break up rocks and get little grains of copper from inside, had to smelt it, and then melt it and pour it into molds, and that's how they progressed by adding tin to the Bronze Age. And that's how they eventually reached the Bronze Age. That didn't happen here because they didn't need to. They have an overabundance of native copper. They didn't find as much 100, 150 years ago during modern mining, but still they were finding pure copper boulders that weighed 100 ton or even 150 ton. Someone found one 10, 15 years ago, and I think it's here in the University Museum now, that's 28 ton. So there are a lot of copper boulders involved. This is it's called, a lot of times it's called a cell, but actually it has a pick-like object at this end. And sometimes they're found in the mining areas, and we think that pick-like thing was used somewhat like a pick. Next, step. I forgot the shovel, which was indistinguishable from a paddle, and the ladder. And this and this came from Whittlesey, as did this gad, his research. Next. Let's talk just for a minute about wedges. They come in different shapes and forms, but basically they're all the same thing and they serve the same purpose. Wedges are primarily a woodworking tool, but they can be used for many other things. In woodworking, a wedge has 3 tasks. One primary task is the wedge is inserted in the end of a log, and when it's pounded into place, probably with a wooden mallet, it splits the log along the grain. The second purpose of a wedge would be to make something tight, so that you put a wedge, it's loose, you put a wedge in there and tighten it up by expanding, by taking the place of the empty spot that causes it to be loose. And the third purpose is to elevate something. It'll raise something up. These are examples of old copper culture wedges. And I might add, many people confuse a wedge with a chisel. And when you're talking about woodworking, the primary difference between a wedge and a chisel is a wedge, it goes with the grain. It splits a log with the grain. A chisel cuts against the grain. So if you wanted to notch the log, you'd use a chisel. You wanted to split the log, you'd use a wedge. Go ahead. This is the only artifact that I've seen like this. It has this little knob on top, and this is the way I presume that it was mounted, adze-like, and it's quite big. I forget if it's 2 pounds. I must have that somewhere. I think it's 2 or 3 pounds. It's a big, heavy thing. And it was found in one of the ancient mines here. And I call it a grub hole, or something like a Maddox prototype. Okay, next. This is supposed to be a basket. That's a basket. Baskets were used in mining. And when you mine copper, it has very sharp edges and a lot of protrusions. And you can even cut your hand quite easily when you first take it out. The first thing that they would do is they would pound those protrusions back, fold things in, make everything smooth. And then they would put it in birch bark baskets for storage or transportation. And that is recorded. I think I have the, somewhere here, we have the, here it is, the Thaler, 1963, he wrote about that. Before, they discovered a huge pit 30 feet across, 10 feet deep, filled with baskets full of copper. And if you put the copper, without processing it the way I just said, if you did that and you put it in a canoe and you took off, the copper would jar in the rapids, and it would soon make a hole in the canoe. Down would go the canoe, the copper, and maybe the other people transporting it. So it carried. Here's our chisel I was talking about. Someone in Coopersville, where I live, took a trip 50 years or so ago up to Isle Royal, and they were walking out and they found this wooden trough. Mike Carey is his name, and he was an East Grand Rapids high school teacher. And it looked very significant to him, so he told the park rangers about it. They found it, it looked significant to them, so they contacted the local archaeologists. They thought it was significant, and I think it's in a museum somewhere. So that is a wooden trough. So here we have a wooden trough, we have baskets, and we have our chisel. Next. Wait, can you go back? So they use gads, axes, shovels, wedges, chisels, punches, drills, picks, grub hoe, baskets, scoops, mattocks, a trough, fire, water, knife, and wooden pegs. And the wooden pegs were used something like the gad when the gad was used as kind of a wedge. And that is, they would drill the holes and then they put in the wooden pegs, and then they would wet the wooden pegs with water. The wooden pegs would swell and crack the rock. And same way that it cracked when they pounded it. And of course, fire and water means that they built huge, heavy fires, and when the rocks were really hot, then they poured cold water on it, and that caused some cracking. And they saw evidence of fires in most of the ancient mining pits, but so far, I don't think anyone has distinguished repeated forest fires from the fires that may have been used in mining. Next. Now, these are also copper chisels, and they were used in the historical mines 100, 150 years ago. And the reason that they were still using copper wedges like this is because if they used iron wedges, sometimes sparks flew. If an iron hits rock, you sometimes get sparks. And sparks are often very dangerous in modern mines, so they were using copper. Go ahead. That's the end. My voice is almost giving out. Does anybody have any questions you'd like to ask? Yes.
I'm wondering about the expanding wood wedges.
Yes.
I never heard that before.
Okay.
So I suppose that you found places where there were wood wedges?
We assume that there were wood wedges because holes have been found, something was pounded into them. And old world mines regularly used wooden wedges. And they also regularly used the gads that I talked about. The gad, which is a drill and a wedge combined, 2 work tasks, that was used around the world, and it was also used prehistorically here, and they've been found in the prehistoric mines, and it was also used by historical mines 100 years or so ago.
You think they might have used freeze thaw too?
Free what?
Freezing water, thawing it, freezing it, like many nights?
I don't know. I've never heard of that. But I don't think that they worked during freezing weather here. I think probably this was pretty much summer work. Any other questions? Yes.
I know you've looked at thousands of artifacts. Could you tell different artifacts that you have seen holes punched in? What kind of holes and what kind of artifacts have holes in them that
Okay.
that could have been punched?
Yes. Punching is the primary way the Indians put holes in copper. And copper punches were sometimes used. For instance, a friend of mine who was an archaeologist for many years has a little gorget, stone gorget, and he found it with the copper punch laying on top of it. So we know that they were used to make holes in stone. They could have been used to make holes in shell. They worked very well to make holes in shell. And then we can see many of the copper holes found in copper, which are lots and lots of them. We can see that it's indented from this side, and you turn it over and it kind of mushroomed and they knocked it down. And so it's so obvious that they punched that in there. Sometimes, most of the time, they're somewhat round. Occasionally, they are square. They're punched in with a square punch. And then copper punches were also used in canoe building and any other thing else using birch bark. And if you use a square or triangular punch on birch bark, it works very well. If you use a round punch on birch bark, it splits on you. Any other questions here? Yes?
Do you ever have a record of large rock hammer stones
Being used where?
as rock crushers.
Rock crushers.
I worked for Calumet and Heckle in 1961 up on the Caledonia Hill. We found one approximately 400 pounds with double grooves on it, one direction, single groove in the other.
This was a 400-pound axe?
I assumed it was used as a crusher.
Well, I don't see anything wrong with that idea.
I'm just wondering, do you have any record of anybody else finding one of these things?
No, the biggest one I've ever seen is the one that I have, that's 37 pounds. And I'm certain that if two men lifted it, it had a cross handle, one man on each side and another man shoving smaller rocks under it, they could crush a lot of rocks in a short period of time. I've never heard your idea. It's a very good one, and I'll remember it.
It's not an idea,
Yes,
it's an observation that
yes.
we actually found it.
Well, do you have pictures of it?
Unfortunately, no, it
Oh.
was 1961 and I didn't have a camera.
Okay, well, I'm glad to know that. Thank you for sharing it. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned earlier about trace elements. Has there been any research done on how far the copper went, either, this continent or in Europe?
I'll take the Europe one first. Both here in the United States and Europe, they have discovered in recent years all copper has trace elements of things other than copper. And they have been able to pretty much fingerprint that to the mines that created the copper, or where the copper, mother lode, where the copper came from. They never, I don't know of anybody in the United States or anybody in Europe setting out to prove that copper from Europe came here. But people in Europe wanted to know, where did this copper on this boatload of oxides come from? So they test 2, 3, 4, 5. They've all come out to someplace in Europe. The same thing out in Connecticut. They have a small amount of a copper mine, very small. And they have a number of copper artifacts. And so they wanted to know, did those copper artifacts, the copper for them, come from the local Connecticut mines, or did it come from Michigan? And so they had it fingerprinted and tested. And it turned out that some of the artifacts came from Isle Royal, some of them came from right here, and some of them came from the copper in Connecticut. So that tells us that so far nobody has been able to find any copper artifact outside of the United States that came from the United States. There's a postscript to that. English adventurers and gentlemen used to travel to the colonies, and so did German and French and Italian and others. When they got here, it was customary to take home souvenirs, to hang on the wall and impress their guests when they came in. I didn't just say I was in America. You see these American Indian copper artifacts and things like that. And so down through the generations, with little written records, or if there were any, they're lost, people come to think that knowing nothing about them, they come to think, well, here it says this is from Greece, and it doesn't say where that's from, and this is from Greece. They must all be Greek. So they get a Greek province, or some other province, but they're actually American Indian artifacts. The opposite, of course, happens in that people from Europe I mean, people from America travel to Europe sometimes during wars and bring back artifacts. And some copper collector, not knowing the difference, most of them didn't 50 years ago or so more, someone wants to earn $5 and he brings in a 8.5-inch spear point from Romania and he sells it to the guy. So there's that confusion. Then maybe his collection is donated to a museum, and so sometimes we find among the old museum pieces, European pieces. I'm a typologist. As far as projectile points go, I can almost always tell the difference between a foreign type and an American type. Now, in the United States, copper from Michigan went up into all the Canadian border areas as far east as Quebec, and it went out into, well, when they excavated for the White House, they found copper artifacts. And some people say that copper, Michigan copper ended up in Florida, but I've never seen proof of it, but it could be true. And it's out in South Dakota, North Dakota. And supposedly even some have gone as far as Arizona. But most of that hasn't been proven yet. They have to do those fingerprinting tests. Did I answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Any other question? Yes. Question? Yes, go ahead.
Agate basin points have been discussed several times. Can you explain what an agate basin point is?
Okay, do you know what a lithic agate basin point is? Okay. It is a lancelot-shaped point with no tang. So there's no tang to attach it, like a Clovis point doesn't have a tang. The agate basin, as was explained to you by somebody else, the base of it being sharp, and you threw it into something, that sharp base can come back and split the shaft, the spear shaft. So they would nick that, grind it, so that it's not as sharp. And they did the same thing with pounding on the copper agate basins. Does that answer the question?
Well, why do they call them agate basins?
The lithic or the copper?
Both.
I think that the lithic, someone else can tell you better than I. Yes.
The agate basin point type is a late Paleolithian projectile point type that was first identified in the western United States. And the region it was found in was agate basin, so that geographic area got attached to that particular point type.
And they just copied the name when they saw the same thing in copper. Jack Steinbring, who has been mentioned several times here, he called it an agate basin. He called it a copper copy of a lithic agate basin, transitional probably between Paleo and Archaic.